The sun was setting over the crazy mountains when Jake Harrison finished mending the last section of fence on his property. At 42, Jake had the weathered hands of a man who'd spent his entire adult life working the land, and the quiet demeanor of someone who'd grown accustomed to talking more to animals than to people. His ranch in Paradise Valley, Montana, was modest by local standards, just 160 acres of rolling grassland with a small herd of cattle, and an old farmhouse that had seen better days. Jake wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of his sleeve and looked toward the barn where his faithful companion, Dolly, was waiting for her evening oats. Dolly was a 15-year-old mule, stubborn as the day was long, but with more sense than most people Jake had ever met. She'd been his constant companion for the past 8 years, ever since he'd bought her from a neighbor who was moving to Arizona. "Come on, girl," Jake called out, his voice carrying across the quiet evening air. "Time for supper." Dolly's ears perked up at the sound of his voice, and she trotted over to the fence where Jake was standing. Her coat was a dusty brown color, and she had intelligent dark eyes that seemed to understand every word Jake said to her. "You're about the only female who's ever been excited to see me," Jake said, scratching behind her ears. Dolly nuzzled his shoulder in response, and Jake couldn't help but smile. It was a conversation they'd had many times before, and while Jake was joking, there was more truth to it than he cared to admit. As he led Dolly to the barn, Jake's mind wandered to the phone call he'd received that afternoon from his sister, Sarah, in Denver. She'd been trying to convince him to come visit for Thanksgiving again, and as always, Jake had politely declined. The truth was, family gatherings had become too painful for him over the years. Watching Sarah's kids grow up, seeing his brother Mike's happy marriage, listening to stories about school plays and soccer games, and all the ordinary miracles of family life, it all served as a reminder of what Jake didn't have and probably never would. "Sarah thinks I'm getting to set in my ways," Jake told Dolly as he filled her feed bucket. "Says I'm becoming a hermit." Dolly snorted and shook her head, sending her mane flying. Jake interpreted this as disagreement with his sister's assessment, though he suspected Dolly might actually be agreeing with Sarah. Jake had always been the quiet one in the Harrison family. While his siblings had gone off to college and built careers in the city, Jake had stayed home to help his father run the ranch. When his parents died within 2 years of each other, his father from a heart attack, his mother from cancer, Jake had inherited the property and the responsibility that came with it. He'd been engaged once to a woman named Carol who worked as a teacher in nearby Livingston. They dated for 3 years and had planned to marry in the spring of 1998. But as their wedding date approached, Carol had begun to have doubts about ranch life. She'd grown up in Billings and had always assumed that Jake would eventually sell the ranch and move somewhere with more opportunities. "I can't spend my whole life watching cows and talking to no one but you," she'd said during their final argument. "This place is beautiful, Jake, but it's not a life, it's just existing." Jake had tried to explain that the ranch wasn't just his livelihood, it was his heritage, his connection to his parents and grandparents who had worked the same land. But Carol had already made up her mind. She'd given him back his ring on a cold February morning, and by summer she was married to an insurance salesman in Bozeman. That had been 7 years ago, and Jake hadn't seriously dated anyone since. He'd convinced himself that he was content with his solitary life, that he didn't need anyone else. But lately, especially during the long winter months when the ranch work slowed down and he spent weeks without seeing another human being, Jake had begun to feel a loneliness that was deeper than anything he'd experienced before. As he finished his evening chores, Jake's thoughts turned to something that had been on his mind more and more frequently. Over the past year, he'd been thinking about adoption. Not in any concrete way, he hadn't called any agencies or filled out any paperwork, but the idea had been growing in his mind like a seed planted in fertile soil. It had started innocently enough. Jake had been in town picking up supplies at the hardware store when he'd overheard a conversation between 2 women at the counter. They'd been talking about a local family who had recently adopted a sibling group, 3 kids whose parents had died in a car accident and who needed a home together. "It's wonderful what the Millers are doing," One of the women had said, "Those kids needed each other, and the Millers have enough love and space for all three." Jake had found himself thinking about those children for days afterward. He'd imagined what it would be like to have kids running around his ranch, learning to ride horses and help with the cattle. He'd pictured himself teaching a son or daughter how to mend fences and read the weather, how to be responsible for something bigger than themselves. But every time Jake let himself indulge in these fantasies, reality would come crashing back. He was a middle-aged bachelor with a modest income and no experience with children. What adoption agency would consider him? Suitable parent material? He lived 20 miles from the nearest town, had no close neighbors, and his idea of a social life was the monthly poker game at the volunteer fire department. "Face it, Dolly," Jake said as he locked up the barn for the night. "I'm not exactly father material." Dolly followed him back to the house, a small 2-bedroom ranch-style home that Jake's grandfather had built in the 1940s. It was comfortable but showing its age. The kitchen appliances were from the 1980s. The hardwood floors were scarred from decades of ranch boots, and the plumbing had a tendency to freeze during particularly cold snaps. Jake made himself a simple dinner of grilled cheese and tomato soup, eating at the kitchen table while he read the Livingston Enterprise. The local newspaper was thin, only 8 pages, but it was his primary source of information about what was happening in the county. On page 4, there was an article that caught his attention. "Local foster care system overwhelmed as winter approaches." The piece described how the state's Department of Child and Family Services was struggling to find homes for an increasing number of children who needed temporary or permanent placement. The article mentioned that they were particularly looking for families willing to take older children or sibling groups. Jake read the article twice, then cut it out and pinned it to the bulletin board next to his refrigerator. He told himself he was just keeping it for reference, but deep down he knew it was something more than that. That night, Jake lay in bed, listening to the wind howl across the valley and thinking about the empty bedroom down the hall. It had been his parents' room, and after they died, Jake had cleaned it out and turned it into a storage room for ranch supplies and old furniture. But lately, he'd been imagining it differently, painted in bright colors, filled with a child's belongings, alive with the sound of laughter and conversation. Jake had never considered himself particularly paternal. He'd never been the uncle who got down on the floor to play with his nieces and nephews, never felt comfortable holding babies or making silly faces to get them to smile. But something had changed in him over the past year, a growing awareness that his life felt incomplete in a way that had nothing to do with romance or career success. "Maybe Sarah's right," Jake said to the darkness. "Maybe I am becoming too set in my ways." But even as he said it, Jake knew that wasn't the whole truth. The real truth was that he was tired of being alone, tired of having no one to share his life with, tired of working toward no greater purpose than his own survival. He wanted to matter to someone. He wanted to be needed. The next morning dawned clear and cold, with a layer of frost covering the pastures and the mountains standing out sharp against the blue sky. Jake went through his usual routine, feeding the cattle, checking water troughs, cleaning stalls, but his mind kept returning to the newspaper article. Around mid-morning, as he was replacing a broken board in the barn wall, Jake heard the sound of a car coming up his driveway. Visitors were rare enough that Jake stopped what he was doing and walked outside to see who it was. The car was a beat-up Honda Civic with Colorado plates, and when it came to a stop near the house, a young woman got out. She looked to be in her early 30s, with shoulder-length brown hair and tired eyes. She was followed by a boy who appeared to be about 10 years old, skinny and serious-looking, wearing a Denver Broncos sweatshirt that was too big for him. "Excuse me," the woman called out. "Are you Jake Harrison?" Jake nodded, wondering how she knew his name. "Yes, ma'am. Can I help you?" The woman walked toward him, the boy staying close by her side. "My name is Lisa Chen. I'm a social worker with the Montana Department of Child and Family Services. This is Danny Kozlov." Jake felt his pulse quicken. He had no idea why a social worker would be at his ranch, but he had a feeling this wasn't a casual visit. "I'm sorry to bother you." Without calling first, Lisa continued, but I was hoping we could talk. Your name was given to us as someone who might be interested in providing a temporary home for a child in need." Jake stared at her, completely confused. "I'm sorry, but there must be some mistake. I never contacted your department about anything." Lisa looked at her notes. "Someone called our office yesterday and suggested we speak with you. They said you'd been asking questions about adoption and foster care." Jake's mind raced, trying to figure out who could have made such a call. Then it hit him: Mrs. Patterson. At the hardware store, she'd been one of the women he'd overheard talking about the Miller family. And yesterday he'd asked her about the article in the newspaper. Mrs. Patterson was well-meaning, but notorious for her tendency to meddle in other people's business. "Look, Miss Chen," Jake said, feeling embarrassed, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. I did ask a few questions about adoption, but I never said I was ready to actually." "Mr. Harrison," Lisa interrupted gently, "I understand this is unexpected, but I was hoping you might at least hear us out. Danny here is in urgent need of a temporary placement, and we're running out of options." Jake looked down at the boy, who was staring at him with dark, serious eyes. Danny didn't say anything, but there was something in his expression that reminded Jake of himself at that age: quiet, watchful, trying to figure out where he fit in the world. "What happened to his parents?" Jake asked. "Danny's father died 3 years ago, and his mother died last month in a car accident. He's been staying with his aunt in Denver, but she's in the military and just got deployed overseas. She can't take him with her, and he doesn't have any other relatives who can care for him." Jake felt a tug in his chest. The boy had lost everything: his parents, his home, his sense of security. Jake knew what it was like to lose parents. Though he'd been an adult when it happened to him, surely there are other families. Jake began. "Mr. Harrison, I'll be honest with you. Danny is what we call a hard-to-place child. He's 10 years old, which is older than most families want. He's been through a lot of trauma, and he's not easy to handle. He's quiet, withdrawn, and he has some behavioral issues. Most of our foster families are looking for younger children or babies." Jake looked at Danny again. The boy was still watching him intently, and Jake could see intelligence in his eyes, but also a wariness that seemed old for someone his age. "What kind of behavioral issues?" Jake asked. "He runs away," Lisa said simply. "He's tried to leave every placement we've put him in. He doesn't trust adults, and he doesn't like to follow rules. His aunt said he's been angry since his mother died, and he acts out when he feels like people are trying to control him." Jake was quiet for a moment, processing this information. A traumatized 10-year-old who ran away and had trouble with authority didn't exactly sound like ideal company for a man who lived alone on a remote ranch. But something about the situation was tugging at Jake's heart. Maybe it was the way Danny was standing slightly behind Lisa, as if he was trying to make himself invisible. Maybe it was the recognition that this boy was as alone in the world as Jake was. Or maybe it was the simple fact that someone needed him, and Jake hadn't felt needed in a very long time. "How temporary are we talking about?" Jake asked. Lisa's face brightened slightly. "Ideally, we'd like to find Danny a permanent adoptive family, but realistically, we might be looking at several months while we search for the right placement. And you think I might be the right kind of temporary placement?" "Mr. Harrison, I'll be honest. You're not our typical foster parent. You're single, you live in a remote area, and you don't have any experience with children. But sometimes, kids like Danny do better in non-traditional environments. He's a country boy at heart. He grew up on a small farm in Colorado before his father died. He might respond well to ranch life." Jake looked at Danny again. "What do you think, son? You interested in learning about cattle ranching for the first time since they'd arrived?" Danny spoke. His voice was quiet but clear. "I know about ranching. My dad had cattle before he got sick." "Is that right?" Jake said. "What kind of cattle?" "Herefords. We had about 30 head." Jake nodded approvingly. Herefords were good cattle, hardy and reliable. "We've got some Herefords here too, and some Black Angus." Danny's expression softened slightly, though he still looked guarded. "Do you have horses?" "I've got a mule named Dolly. She's not much to look at, but she's got more sense than most horses I've known." For the first time, Jake saw what might have been the hint of a smile crossed Danny's face. Lisa looked between Jake and Danny, and Jake could see that she was hoping this might work out. "Mr. Harrison, would you be willing to consider taking Danny on a trial basis? Just for a few weeks, to see how it goes?" Jake was quiet for a long moment. This morning he'd been a bachelor rancher with no responsibilities beyond his cattle and his mule. Now he was being asked to take in a traumatized child who had a history of running away. It was a huge leap, and every rational part of his mind was telling him to say no. But then Jake thought about the empty bedroom in his house, about the newspaper article pinned to his bulletin board, about all the nights he'd lain awake feeling like his life was missing something essential. "Can I think about it overnight?" Jake asked. Lisa nodded. "Of course, but Mr. Harrison, I need to be honest with you. If you can't take Danny, I'm not sure where else we can place him. The other option is a group home in Billings, and that's not ideal for a child who's already dealing with so much loss." Jake looked at Danny one more time. The boy was watching him with an expression that was both hopeful and resigned, as if he was used to disappointment, but still couldn't help hoping for something better. "You know what?" Jake said suddenly. "Let's skip the overnight thinking. Danny, would you like to meet Dolly?" Danny nodded, and for the first time since they'd arrived, he stepped out from behind Lisa. As they walked toward the barn, Jake felt a mixture of excitement and terror. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but something felt right about this moment. Maybe it was time to stop being afraid of change. Maybe it was time to take a chance on something bigger than himself. "Fair warning," Jake said to Danny. As they approached the barn, "Dolly's got opinions about everything, and she's not shy about sharing them." Danny looked up at him with what was definitely a smile this time. "My dad always said mules were smarter than horses because they knew when to be stubborn." Jake grinned. "Your dad sounds like he was a wise man." As they reached the barn door, Jake realized that his life was about to change in ways he couldn't even imagine. But for the first time in years, change didn't feel scary. It felt like possibility. Danny had been at the ranch for 2 weeks, and Jake was beginning to understand why the boy was considered difficult to place. It wasn't that Danny was disrespectful or destructive. In fact, he was almost unnaturally well behaved. The problem was that he was like a ghost in the house, moving through his days with the careful precision of someone who didn't want to draw attention to himself. He woke up before Jake every morning, made his bed with military precision, ate whatever was put in front of him without complaint, and spent most of his free time sitting on the porch staring out at the mountains. He answered questions when asked, but rarely volunteered information about himself. He helped with chores when directed, but showed no initiative or curiosity about ranch work. Most troubling of all, he hadn't laughed once since he'd arrived. Jake was beginning to think he'd made a serious mistake. He'd imagined that having a child around would bring energy and life to the ranch, but instead it felt like he was living with a polite stranger who was just waiting for the right moment to disappear. "I don't know what I'm doing wrong," Jake told Dolly one morning as he brushed her coat. Danny was in the house getting dressed for school, and Jake had taken to using these private moments with his mule to voice his frustrations. Dolly turned her head to look at him with one dark eye, as if to say that the answer should be obvious. "I've tried everything I can think of," Jake continued. "I've shown him how to work cattle, taught him to drive the tractor, even let him help me fix the truck engine. He does everything I ask, but it's like he's not really there." The truth was, Jake was starting to panic. Lisa Chen had called yesterday to check on how things were going, and Jake had given her an upbeat report he didn't really feel. She'd mentioned that she was still looking for a permanent placement for Danny, and Jake had found himself hoping she wouldn't find one too quickly. Despite Danny's emotional distance, Jake had grown attached to the boy. There was something about his quiet dignity and obvious intelligence that reminded Jake of himself at that age, and every now and then, Jake would catch glimpses of the person Danny might be underneath all the protective walls he'd built. Like yesterday, when Jake had been trying to fix a broken water pipe and had been cursing colorfully at his inability to get the fitting to cooperate. Danny had appeared silently at his elbow and handed him the exact wrench he needed, then disappeared just as quietly, or the way Danny's eyes lit up when he saw Dolly in the pasture. Even though he'd never asked to ride her or spend time with her, Jake was beginning to realize that Danny was like a wild animal that had been hurt too many times. He needed to be approached carefully, with patience and consistency. Until he learned to trust again, the breakthrough came on a Saturday morning. When Jake was in the barn repairing a saddle, Danny was supposed to be doing homework at the kitchen table. But Jake heard footsteps behind him and turned to see the boy standing in the doorway. "Mr. Harrison." Danny's voice was hesitant, as if he wasn't sure he should be interrupting. "Call me Jake, son. What's on your mind?" Danny stepped into the barn, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "That mule of yours, Dolly, is she sick?" Jake looked up from the saddle, concerned. "Not that I know of." "Why?" "She's been standing by the fence all morning, just staring at the mountains, as she won't eat her hay." Jake set down his tools and followed Danny outside. Sure enough, Dolly was standing at the far end of the pasture, her head hanging low and her usual alertness replaced by something that looked almost like melancholy. "Huh," Jake said, walking toward the fence. "That's not like her." Danny fell into step beside him. "My dad always said animals could sense things people couldn't. Maybe she knows something's wrong." Jake glanced at the boy, surprised by this unprompted sharing of information about his father. It was the first time Danny had mentioned his parents without being asked directly. "Your dad sounds like he knew animals pretty well," Jake said carefully, not wanting to break the spell of Danny actually talking to him. "He grew up on a ranch in Wyoming. Said animals were better than people because they didn't lie about what they were feeling." They reached the fence, and Jake called out to Dolly. The mule looked up but didn't come over, which was unusual. Normally she would trot over at the sound of Jake's voice, hoping for treats or attention. "Something's definitely not right," Jake said. He climbed over the fence and walked toward Dolly, with Danny following close behind. As they got closer, Jake could see what the problem was. Dolly was favoring her left front leg, barely putting weight on it. When Jake knelt down to examine her hoof, he found a sharp piece of metal embedded in the soft part of her foot. "Poor girl," Jake said softly. "That's got to hurt." Danny knelt down beside him, his earlier reserve forgotten in his concern for the animal. "Is it bad?" "It's not good, but it's not life-threatening either. I need to get this metal out and clean the wound, but she's not going to like it much." Jake looked at Danny, making a decision. "Want to help me? I could use an extra pair of hands." For the first time since he'd arrived at the ranch, Danny showed genuine enthusiasm. "Yes, sir. What do you need me to do?" "First, we need to get her back to the barn where I've got my tools. Think you can help me convince her to walk on 3 legs?" Danny nodded seriously, and Jake was struck by how much the boy's face changed when he was focused on something he cared about. The careful blankness was replaced by intelligence and determination. Getting Dolly to the barn was a slow process. She was in pain and not inclined to cooperate, and it took both Jake and Danny working together to coax her along. Danny proved to have a natural way with the mule, speaking to her in low, soothing tones and somehow knowing exactly when to encourage her and when to give her a moment to rest. "You've done this before," Jake observed as they finally got Dolly into her stall. "My dad let me help when the animals got hurt," Danny said. "He said it was important to learn how to take care of things that depended on you." Jake felt a pang of sadness for this boy who had lost so much, but he also felt a growing respect for the man who had raised Danny. To have such a strong sense of responsibility. "Your dad was right," Jake said. "Now, I'm going to need you to hold Dolly's head while I work on her foot. Can you do that?" Danny nodded and moved to Dolly's head, placing his hands on either side of her face and speaking to her in the same calm voice he'd used to get her to the barn. Jake was amazed at how naturally the boy seemed to understand what the animal needed. Removing the metal from Dolly's hoof was delicate work. Jake had to be careful not to cause more damage while extracting the foreign object, and Dolly was understandably nervous about having her injured foot manipulated. But Danny's steady presence at her head seemed to calm her, and she stood remarkably still throughout the procedure. "There we go," Jake said finally, holding up a jagged piece of rusted metal. "That's what was causing all the trouble." Danny examined the metal with interest. Where do you think it came from? Probably left over from when my grandfather built the original barn. This place is full of old nails and screws that worked there. Way to the surface over time. Jake cleaned and bandaged Dolly's wound while Danny continued to hold her steady. It was the longest period of time the boy had spent focused on a single task since he'd arrived, and Jake could see that he was completely absorbed in caring for the injured animal. Is she going to be okay? Danny asked as Jake finished wrapping. The hoof, she'll be fine. Mules are tough, and this wasn't a deep. She'll need to take it easy for a few days, but she should be back to normal soon. Danny nodded, but Jake could see that he was still worried. Can I help take care of her while she's healing? Jake felt something warm spread through his chest. This was the first time Danny had asked for anything since he'd arrived. At the ranch, I'd appreciate that, Jake said. Dolly's always been partial to people who treat her right. I think she'd like having you look after her over the next few days. Danny threw himself into caring for Dolly with an intensity that surprised Jake. He checked on her multiple times throughout the day, brought her fresh water and hay, and sat with her in the barn talking quietly about things Jake couldn't quite hear. More importantly, the careful distance Danny had maintained since his arrival began to dissolve. He started asking questions about ranch work, offering to help with chores without being asked, and even sharing stories about his life before his parents died. My mom used to say I had a gift with animals, Danny told Jake one evening as they watched Dolly test her healing hoof. She said it was because I listened to them instead of just trying to make them do what I wanted. Sounds like your mom was pretty wise too, Jake said. Danny nodded. She was. She knew everything about everything. Dad always said she was the brains of the operation. Jake could hear the pain in the boy's voice, but also something else, a willingness to share memories that were precious to him. It was progress, and Jake was careful not to push too hard. They sound like they were good parents. Jake said simply, they were. They taught me that family isn't just about being related to people. It's about taking care of each other and being there when things get hard. Jake felt his throat tighten. He wondered if Danny was trying to tell him something, or if he was just sharing a memory that felt safe to talk about. That's a good lesson, Jake said. Danny was quiet for a moment, watching Dolly nibble at some hay. Then he looked up at Jake with an expression that was more open than anything Jake had seen from him before. Jake, Danny's voice was tentative. Are you going to send me away? The question hit Jake like a physical blow. Why would you think that? Because that's what always happens. People try to help me, but then they realize I'm too much trouble and they find somewhere else for me to go. Jake knelt down so he was at Danny's eye level. Danny, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I'm not sending you anywhere unless you want to go. You're not too much trouble, and you're not a burden. You're a good kid who's been through some terrible things, and you deserve to have a place where you feel safe and wanted. Danny's eyes filled with tears that he quickly wiped away. But I don't know how to be in a family anymore. I don't know how to be normal, son. I don't know how to be in a family either. I've been living alone for so long I'd forgotten what it was like to have someone else around. We're both learning as we go. Jake paused, choosing his words carefully. But I'll tell you what I've learned in the past few weeks. Having you here has made this place feel more like a home than it has in years. You've got good instincts, you work hard, and you care about the things that matter. Those are the qualities that make a good man, and they're the qualities that make a good son. Danny stared at him for a long moment. Do you really mean that? I've never meant anything more in my life. For the first time since he'd arrived at the ranch, Danny smiled, not just the polite expression he'd been wearing, but a real smile that reached his eyes and transformed his whole face. Jake, Danny said, would it be okay if I called you Dad? Jake felt his eyes fill with tears. I'd be honored, son. I'd be absolutely honored. As they stood in the barn with Dolly watching them, with her wise old eyes, Jake realized that everything had changed. He was no longer a lonely bachelor trying to figure out how to care for a traumatized child. He was a father, and Danny was his son. And somehow they were going to figure out how to be a family together. It wouldn't be easy there. Would be challenges ahead, legal hurdles to overcome, and emotional healing that would take time. But for the first time since Carol had left him 7 years ago, Jake felt like his life had real purpose and meaning. Looking at Danny, his son, Jake knew that whatever came next, they would face it together. 3 months had passed since Danny had started calling Jake Dad, and the transformation in both of them was remarkable. The quiet, withdrawn boy who had arrived at the ranch in September had become a confident, talkative kid who threw himself into ranch work with enthusiasm and skill that amazed Jake daily. And Jake, who had lived like a hermit for years, found himself planning activities around what would interest Danny, cooking actual meals instead of opening cans, and discovering that he had more patience and nurturing instincts than he'd ever imagined. The legal situation was more complicated. Lisa Chen had been working with Jake to complete the paperwork for formal adoption, but the process was slow and bureaucratic. Jake had undergone background checks, home inspections, and interviews with various social workers and court officials. Everyone agreed that Danny was thriving in Jake's care, but the wheels of the legal system moved at their own pace. These things take time, Lisa had assured Jake during her last visit. But I don't see any red flags. You've provided Danny with stability and love, and that's what matters most. Jake tried to be patient, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to go wrong. Maybe it was the pessimism that came from years of disappointment, or maybe it was the protective instinct that had developed since Danny had become his son. Either way, Jake found himself worrying about things beyond his control. On this particular December morning, Jake was in the barn helping Danny with his 4-H project, raising a heifer calf for the county fair. Danny had named the calf Rosie, and she had become his pride and joy. He spent hours training her to lead properly and grooming her coat until it shone. "Look at that, Dad," Danny said, beaming as Rosie followed him around the pen without pulling on the lead rope. "She's finally getting it." Jake felt the familiar warmth that came from hearing Danny call him Dad. It still caught him off guard sometimes, the way the simple word could make him feel like the most important person in the world. "She looks good, son. You've done great work with her." Danny had shot up 3 inches since arriving at the ranch, and his face had lost the gaunt look it had carried when he first came. Good food, hard work, and emotional security had transformed him into a healthy, happy kid who looked forward to each day with anticipation. "Mr. Peterson thinks I might have a chance at placing in the competition," Danny said, referring to his 4-H leader. "He says Rosie's got good conformation and I've trained her well." "I think you've got more than a chance," Jake said. "I think you're going to do great." They were interrupted by the sound of a car coming up the driveway. Jake looked out the barn door and saw a black sedan with government plates. Not Lisa Chen's usual car, but something more official looking. "Stay here with Rosie," Jake told Danny, though he tried to keep his voice casual. "I'll see who it is," but Danny had already seen the car, and Jake could see the familiar wariness creeping back into his expression. Over the months, Danny had learned to relax and trust that Jake wasn't going anywhere, but official-looking vehicles still made him nervous. Two people got out of the car, a middle-aged woman in a business suit and a younger man carrying a briefcase. Jake didn't recognize either of them, but something about their demeanor made his stomach clench with anxiety. "Mr. Harrison," the woman called out as Jake approached. "I'm Sandra Williams from the Montana Department of Child and Family Services, and this is Mark Thompson from the State Attorney General's office. We need to speak with you about Danny Kozlov." Jake felt like the ground had shifted beneath his feet. "Is there a problem? May we come inside?" Sandra asked. "This is a matter that requires some privacy." Jake nodded and led them into the house, his mind racing through possible scenarios. Had someone challenged the adoption? Was there some legal issue he wasn't aware of? Had Danny's aunt changed her mind about the deployment? "Mr. Harrison," Sandra began once they were seated in Jake's living room, "we've received some concerning information about Danny's placement in your home." "What kind of information?" Jake asked, working to keep his voice steady. Mark Thompson opened his briefcase and pulled out a folder. "We've been contacted by Danny's maternal grandfather, Robert Morrison. He lives in Seattle and claims he was never notified that Danny needed placement. After his mother's death," Jake stared at them, "his grandfather. Danny never mentioned a grandfather. Apparently there was an estrangement in the family," Sandra explained. Mr. Morrison and his daughter had a falling out several years ago, and they hadn't been in contact, but he learned about her death through a mutual friend and has been searching for Danny ever since. Jake felt a chill run down his spine, and now he wants custody. He's demanding custody. Mark Thompson said, as Danny's closest living relative, he has a strong legal claim. He's filed a petition with the court to have Danny removed from your care immediately. But Danny's been here for months, Jake protested. He's happy. He's doing well in school. He's got friends and activities. You can't just uproot him again. Sandra's expression was sympathetic but firm. Mr. Harrison, I understand this is difficult, but family reunification is always our primary goal. If Danny has a blood relative who wants him and can provide appropriate care, that takes precedence over foster placement. Jake stood up abruptly, pacing to the window where he could see Danny in the barn with Rosie. The boy was laughing at something the calf had done, completely unaware that his world was about to be shattered again. What kind of man lets his daughter die without even knowing she's in trouble? Jake asked, anger creeping into his voice. What kind of grandfather doesn't know his own grandson exists? Until the kid's been orphaned for months, the estrangement appears to have been mutual. Mark Thompson said, Mr. Morrison says he tried to maintain contact, but his daughter refused his calls and returned his letters unopened. He claims he didn't even know about Danny's existence until recently. And you believe him? Mr. Harrison, Sandra said gently, it doesn't matter what we believe. What matters is that he's Danny's grandfather. He has legal standing, and he's petitioning for custody. The court has to take his claim seriously. Jake sat back down heavily, feeling like he was living in a nightmare. What about what Danny wants? Doesn't his opinion count for anything? Danny's preferences will be considered, Sandra said. But he's a minor, and the court's primary concern is his best interests as determined by the law. His best interests? Jake's voice was rising despite his efforts to stay calm. His best interests are to stay where he's loved and cared for, where he's built a life and formed attachments. You people are the ones who placed him here in the first place. Mark Thompson leaned forward. Mr. Harrison, I understand you're upset, but you need to understand that this placement was always intended to be temporary. You knew from the beginning that we were looking for a permanent solution. I thought I was the permanent solution, Jake said quietly. I thought we were going to adopt him. That was one possibility, Sandra acknowledged. But the appearance of a blood relative changes things significantly. Jake felt like he was drowning. After months of believing that Danny was going to be his son permanently, the idea of losing him was almost unbearable. But worse than his own pain was the thought of what this would do to Danny, who had already lost so much. When Jake asked finally, Mr. Morrison is flying in tomorrow, Sandra said. We'd like to arrange a meeting so he can meet Danny and begin the transition process. Transition process? Jake's voice was barely above a whisper. Mr. Morrison lives in Seattle, where he owns a successful construction company. He's married and has a large house with room for Danny. He's prepared to take custody immediately. Jake closed his eyes, trying to process this information. Tomorrow. They wanted to take Danny away tomorrow. I want to fight this, Jake said. Suddenly, I want to contest his petition. Mark Thompson and Sandra exchanged glances. Mr. Harrison, you certainly have the right to legal representation, but I should warn you that cases like this rarely go in favor of non-relatives. The law strongly favors biological family. I don't care about the law, Jake said fiercely. I care about Danny, and I'm not giving him up without a fight. After the social workers left, Jake sat in his kitchen staring at the phone, trying to figure out how to tell Danny that everything was about to change again. Through the window, he could see the boy still working with Rosie, completely absorbed in his 4-H project and blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit. Jake picked up the phone and called the only lawyer he knew, Bill Crawford, who had handled his parents' estate and various ranch legal matters over the years. Bill wasn't a family law specialist, but he was honest and he cared about doing right by his clients. Bill, it's Jake Harrison. I need help. Someone's trying to take my son away from me. Slow down, Jake, Bill said. Start from the beginning. Jake explained the situation as clearly as he could. though his emotions kept threatening to overwhelm his ability to think rationally. Bill listened without interrupting, asking clarifying questions when necessary. "Jake," Bill said when he'd finished, "I'm going to be straight with you. This is an uphill battle. Grandparents have strong rights, especially when there's no other family involved. But Danny doesn't even know this man exists. How can someone who's been completely absent from his life suddenly have more rights than the person who's been caring for him? Because that's how the law works. It prioritizes blood relationships over emotional bonds, especially when children are involved." Jake felt his heart sink. "So there's no chance. I didn't say that. There are arguments we can make about Danny's best interests, about the stability you've provided, about the trauma of another disruption. But Jake, you need to understand that even if we win temporarily, this could drag on for months or years, and it's going to be expensive. I don't care about the money. What about Danny? Is he prepared for a legal battle that could last months? Is it fair to put him through that uncertainty?" Jake was quiet for a moment. Bill was right. Danny had already been through enough trauma and uncertainty. The idea of subjecting him to a prolonged legal battle was almost as painful as the idea of losing him. "Bill, if I don't fight this, they're taking him tomorrow." "Tomorrow? How is that in his best interests?" "It's not," Bill said firmly. "Give me until tonight to make some calls. I want to see if we can at least slow this down, give Danny some time to adjust to the idea." After hanging up with Bill, Jake forced himself to go out to the barn. Danny looked up as he approached, and Jake could see that the boy had picked up on his mood. "Dad, is everything okay? Who were those people?" Jake sat down on a hay bale, and Danny came to sit beside him. Rosie followed, nuzzling Danny's shoulder with her soft nose. "Danny, I need to tell you something, and it's going to be hard to hear." Danny's face went pale, and Jake could see him bracing for bad news. "Are you sick? Are you going to die?" "No, son, nothing like that. But it turns out you have family that we didn't know about. Your mother's father, your grandfather, has been looking for you." Danny stared at him for a long moment. "My mom said her dad was dead." Maybe she thought it was easier than explaining why they didn't talk to each other. Families sometimes have falling outs, and people say things they don't mean. "What does he want?" Jake took a deep breath. "He wants you to come live with him in Seattle." The color drained completely from Danny's face. "No, I don't want to go. I want to stay here with you." "I know, son. I want that too. But he's your grandfather, and the law says that family members have first rights when it comes to custody." Danny stood up abruptly, his fists clenched at his sides. "I don't care what the law says. You're my family now. This is my home." Jake pulled Danny into a hug, feeling the boy's shoulders shake with emotion. "Danny, listen to me. I am going to fight this with everything I have. But I need you to know that no matter what happens, you will always be my son. Always. That's not something anyone can take away from us." "But what if they make me go? What if I never see you again?" "That's not going to happen," Jake said fiercely. "Even if you have to go with your grandfather for a while, I will find a way to stay in your life. I promise you that." Danny pulled back to look at Jake, tears streaming down his face. "Why does this keep happening to me? Why can't I just have a family that stays together?" Jake felt his own eyes fill with tears. "I don't know, son. I wish I could fix it, but I can't. All I can do is promise you that I will never stop fighting for you, and I will never stop loving you." That night, Danny climbed into bed with Jake the way he had during his first week at the ranch, when nightmares about his parents' deaths had made sleep impossible. They lay in the darkness, both pretending to sleep while their minds raced with worry about the future. "Dad?" Danny's voice was small in the darkness. "Yeah, son, if I have to go. Will you take care of Rosie for me?" Jake's throat tightened. "Of course I will, but you're going to be back to take care of her yourself. Promise, I promise." "Danny, whatever it takes, I'm bringing you home." As Jake lay awake listening to Danny's breathing eventually slow into sleep, he made a vow to himself. He might not have money or connections or legal experience, but he had something more powerful than all of those things, a father's love for his son. And he was going to use that love to move mountains if he had to. Tomorrow, Robert Morrison would arrive to claim his grandson, but Jake Harrison wasn't giving up without the fight of his life. Robert Morrison was not what Jake had expected. Instead of the cold, distant figure Jake had imagined, Danny's grandfather was a soft-spoken man in his 60s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. He was tall and lean, with graying hair and a gentle demeanor that made Jake's prepared arguments about his unworthiness seem petty and unfair. The meeting took place at the DCFS office in Livingston, with Sandra Williams mediating and both lawyers present. Danny sat between Jake and his grandfather, looking small and overwhelmed by the adult drama playing out around him. "Danny," Robert said quietly, "I know this is confusing for you. I know you don't remember me, and I know you're happy here with Mr. Harrison." Danny didn't respond, but Jake could see him stealing glances at his grandfather, clearly trying to reconcile this gentle stranger with whatever stories his mother had told him. "Your mom and I had a fight when she was 18, Robert continued. "It was about your dad, actually. I didn't think he was good enough for her, and I said some things I shouldn't have said. She was so angry that she left Seattle and never came back." Robert's voice broke slightly. "I tried to reach out over the years, but she wouldn't talk to me. I hired investigators to find her after she moved, but she was good at staying hidden. I didn't even know you existed until a friend from the old neighborhood told me about the accident." Jake watched Danny's face, seeing the boy's confusion and conflict. Part of him was clearly curious about this missing piece of his family history, but his loyalty to Jake was stronger. "I don't want to leave the ranch," Danny said quietly but firmly. "Jake is my dad now." Robert nodded sadly. "I understand that, Danny, and I can see that Mr. Harrison loves you very much. But son, you're all the family I have left in the world. Your mom was my only child, and you're my only grandchild. I've missed 10 years of your life already, and I can't stand to miss any more." "But I have a life here," Danny protested. "I have friends in school and my 4-H project, and Dolly needs me." "Who's Dolly?" Robert asked. "My mule," Jake said. "Danny's been helping me care for her since he arrived. She's pretty attached to him." Robert looked surprised. "You have a mule? Dolly's the smartest animal I've ever known," Danny said, speaking directly to his grandfather for the first time. "She's stubborn and opinionated, but she always knows the right thing to do." Despite the tension in the room, Robert smiled. "Your grandmother had a mule when I first met her, named Buttercup, meanest animal you ever saw, but your grandmother loved that mule more than anything." Danny looked interested despite himself. "I had a grandmother. Her name was Helen, and she would have loved you so much. She died 3 years ago, but she always hoped she'd get to meet her grandchild someday." Jake saw the moment when Danny's resolve began to waver. The boy was clearly torn between his loyalty to Jake and his curiosity about this family he'd never known he had. "Mr. Morrison," Jake said, "I understand your desire to know your grandson, but Danny has been through enough upheaval in his life. Wouldn't it be better to let him stay where he's stable and happy?" Robert turned to Jake with an expression that was both understanding and determined. "Mr. Harrison, I can see that you've given Danny a good home, and I'm grateful for that. But he's my blood, my family. Surely you can understand why I need him with me." "What I understand," Jake said, his voice rising slightly, "is that Danny has been abandoned by family before. His aunt shipped him off rather than take responsibility for him." "How do I know you won't do the same thing when things get difficult?" Robert's face flushed. "I'm not his aunt. I'm his grandfather, and I've been searching for him for months. I've rearranged my entire life to make room for him." "Dad," Danny said quietly, and both men turned to look at him. "Can I talk to you outside?" Jake nodded and followed Danny out of the conference room. They stood in the hallway, and Jake could see that Danny was struggling with emotions he couldn't quite articulate. "Dad, what if he's telling the truth? What if my mom lied about him being dead because she was mad?" Jake knelt down so he was at Danny's eye level. "Son, it's possible. People sometimes say things they don't mean when they're hurt or angry. But I don't want to leave you. You're my real dad, and you're my real son, no matter what happens. That's never going to change." Danny was quiet for a moment. "What if I went with him? But just for a visit, like, to see what he's like and learn about my mom's family?" Jake felt his heart break a little, but he knew that Danny was trying to find a solution. that would work for everyone. If that's what you want to do, I'll support you. But Danny, I need you to promise me something. What? If you don't feel safe or happy there, you call me immediately. I'll come get you. No matter what anyone says. Danny nodded solemnly. I promise. When they returned to the conference room, Danny addressed his grandfather directly. I'll come visit you in Seattle, but I want to come back here for Christmas, and I want to be back in time for the county fair in August. Robert's face lit up with hope. Of course, we can work out a visitation schedule, and I want to call Jake every day, and I want him to be able to visit me. Danny, Sandra Williams interjected. I'm not sure that's how custody arrangements typically work. Then maybe we need an atypical arrangement, said a new voice from the doorway. Everyone turned to see Bill Crawford entering the room, followed by a woman Jake didn't recognize. Bill, Jake said, confused. What are you doing here? Fighting for my client. Bill said with a slight smile, and I'd like you all to meet Dr. Sarah Hendricks. She's a child psychologist who specializes in trauma and family dynamics. Dr. Hendricks stepped forward. I've reviewed Danny's case file, and I have some concerns about disrupting his placement at this time. Sandra Williams looked annoyed. Dr. Hendricks, while we appreciate your expertise, this is primarily a legal matter. Actually, it's primarily a matter of what's best for the child, Dr. Hendricks said firmly. And what's best for Danny is stability and continuity of care. He's formed a strong attachment to Mr. Harrison, and disrupting that bond could cause significant psychological harm. But surely being with his biological grandfather would be preferable, Mark Thompson argued. Not necessarily. Danny has experienced multiple losses and disruptions in his short life. What he needs now is consistency and security, not another major change. Robert Morrison looked troubled. Dr. Hendricks, I understand your concerns, but I'm not trying to harm Danny. I'm trying to give him a family. Mr. Morrison, I don't doubt your good intentions, but Danny already has a family, one that he's chosen, and that has chosen him. What I'm suggesting is a gradual integration that allows Danny to maintain his primary attachments while exploring his relationship with you. Bill Crawford opened his briefcase. I've prepared a proposal for a shared custody arrangement. Danny would spend the school year with Jake, and summers with his grandfather, with regular visitation and communication. Throughout, Jake felt a surge of hope. It wasn't perfect. He still wanted Danny to stay with him full-time, but it was better than losing him completely. Robert was quiet for a long moment, clearly considering the proposal. What does Danny want? Everyone turned to look at the boy, who had been following the adult conversation with intense concentration. I want to stay with my dad during school, Danny said firmly, but I want to get to know you too, and I want everyone to stop fighting about me like I'm not even here. The room fell silent, and Jake felt a surge of pride at Danny's maturity and clarity. You know what? Robert said finally. The boy's right. Danny, I'm sorry for making decisions about your life without asking what you wanted. He turned to Jake. Mr. Harrison, would you be willing to share custody? I promise you, I'm not trying to take him away from you permanently. I just want the chance to know my grandson. Jake looked at Danny, who was watching him with hopeful eyes. If that's what Danny wants, then that's what we'll do. The custody arrangement took several more hours to negotiate, with lawyers drafting agreements and social workers ensuring that Danny's best interests were protected. In the end, they settled on a plan that would allow Danny to finish the school year with Jake, spend the summer getting to know his grandfather in Seattle, and then return to Montana for his senior year of high school. There's one more thing, Danny said as they were finalizing the paperwork. I want both of you at my 4-H competition. Together, Robert looked confused. What's 4-H? It's a youth organization that teaches kids about agriculture and responsibility. Jake explained. Danny's been raising a heifer calf for competition. I'd be honored to attend. Robert said, I'd like to learn about everything that's important to you, Danny. 6 months later, Jake stood at the county fair watching Danny show Rosie in the heifer competition. In the stands, Robert Morrison cheered just as loudly as Jake did when Danny won second place in his division. The custody arrangement had worked better than anyone had expected. Danny had spent the summer in Seattle, calling Jake every few days. to tell him about his adventures with his grandfather. Robert had taken him fishing and hiking, taught him about construction work, and shared stories about Danny's mother that helped the boy understand his family history. More importantly, Robert had proven himself to be a man of his word. He had never tried to undermine Jake's relationship with Danny or convince the boy to stay in Seattle permanently. Instead, he had encouraged Danny to maintain his connection to the ranch and had even visited Montana twice. During the summer, "Dad," Danny said, running up to Jake after the competition with his red ribbon in hand, "did you see? Rosie did great." "I saw, son. I'm so proud of you." Robert approached them, smiling broadly. "Congratulations, Danny. That was impressive." "Thanks, Grandpa. Want to meet Rosie officially?" As Jake watched Danny introduce his grandfather to his prize-winning heifer, he marveled at how much their lives had changed. A year ago, he had been a lonely bachelor with only a mule for company. Now he was part of a family, an unconventional family, perhaps, but a real one nonetheless. "Jake," Robert said quietly while Danny was busy with Rosie, "I want to thank you." "For what?" "For raising my grandson to be such a good kid. For giving him the stability and love he needed. For being willing to share him with me instead of making this a battle." Jake nodded. "He's a special boy. He deserves all the love and family he can get." Robert was quiet for a moment. "You know, when I first came to take him, I thought I was rescuing him from a temporary situation. I didn't understand that I was trying to take him away from his real father." "Robert, no. Let me finish. You're his father in every way that matters. I'm grateful to be his grandfather, to have a relationship with him, but I understand now that his home is here with you." Jake felt tears prick his eyes. "He's lucky to have both of us." "Yeah," Robert said, watching Danny laugh as Rosie licked his face. "I think he is." That evening, the three of them sat on Jake's porch watching the sunset over the crazy mountains. Dolly grazed nearby, and Rosie dozed in the pasture, worn out from her big day at the fair. "Dad," Danny said, "when I graduate high school, can I study agriculture in college?" "You can study whatever makes you happy, son." "Good. Because I want to come back and run this ranch someday. Maybe expand it, raise more cattle." Jake smiled. "I'd like that very much. And Grandpa, will you help me learn about the business side of things, about running a company?" Robert nodded. "I'd be honored to help." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jake reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, he had thought he wanted to adopt a child to fill the emptiness in his life. What he had discovered instead was that love wasn't about ownership or possession. It was about wanting what was best for the people you cared about, even when that meant sharing them with others. Danny had taught him that family could be created as well as inherited, that bonds forged by choice and love could be just as strong as those created by blood, and Robert had taught him that it was possible for two people to love the same child without competing for that child's affection. "You know what?" Danny said suddenly. "I think Mom would be happy about all this. She always said that the best families were the ones where everyone chose to be there." Jake and Robert exchanged a look over Danny's head, both men thinking about the woman who had brought them together through her son. "I think you're right," Jake said softly. "I think she'd be very happy." As they sat in comfortable silence, Jake realized that his life had turned out nothing like he'd planned and everything like he'd hoped. He was a father, Danny was his son, and they were surrounded by people who loved them both. It wasn't the conventional family he'd once imagined, but it was perfect in its own way. Sometimes the best families were the ones you never saw coming. Epilogue. 5 years later, Jake stood in the pasture, watching Danny, now 21 and a recent graduate of Montana State University with a degree in agricultural business, work with a young horse. Danny had inherited his father's gentle way with animals and had added his own innovations to the ranch, including a successful horse training program. Robert Morrison had kept his promise to help Danny learn the business side of ranching, and together they had developed a plan to expand the operation. Robert had even moved to Montana the previous year, buying a small house in Livingston so he could be closer to his grandson, while still maintaining his independence. "Grandpa's here," Danny called out, pointing to the familiar pickup truck coming. Up the driveway. Robert had traded his Seattle construction business for a small ranch equipment dealership in Montana, claiming that retirement in the city was boring. Jake suspected the real reason was that Robert had fallen in love with Montana the way so many people did, gradually, then completely. "How's the new horse coming along?" Robert asked as he joined them at the fence. "She's smart," Danny said. "Reminds me of Dolly, stubborn, but willing to work if you treat her right." Jake smiled at the comparison. Dolly was still with them, now 21 years old and officially retired from anything more strenuous than supervising the ranch operations. She had become something of a legend in the valley, known for her longevity and her uncanny ability to judge a person's character. Speaking of Dolly, Danny said, "I've been thinking about something." "What's that?" Jake asked. "I want to start a program for kids in foster care, bring them out to the ranch to work with the animals. Maybe some of them would benefit from what I got here." Jake felt his chest swell with pride. "That's a great idea, son. I'll help fund it," Robert added. "And I know some people in the state government who might be interested in supporting something like that." As they walked back toward the house, Jake marveled at how their unconventional family had grown and evolved. Danny had become the man Jake had always hoped he would be: kind, responsible, innovative, and deeply connected to the land and the values that had shaped him. "Dad," Danny said as they reached the porch, "I have some news." Jake looked at his son's face and saw excitement and nervousness in equal measure. "Sarah and I are engaged." Jake broke into a huge grin. Sarah was a veterinarian Danny had met in college, and Jake had liked her immediately. She was smart, funny, and completely comfortable with ranch life, plus she treated Dolly with the respect the old mule deserved. "That's wonderful news, son. Have you set a date?" "Next summer. We want to have the wedding here on the ranch, if that's okay." "I can't think of anything I'd like more." Robert clapped Danny on the back. "Congratulations, grandson. When do I get to officially meet my future granddaughter-in-law? She's coming for dinner Sunday. Fair warning, she wants to hear all your embarrassing stories about me." As they settled onto the porch with cold beers, Jake reflected on the unexpected turns his life had taken. He'd started out as a lonely rancher with only a mule for company, convinced that his chance for family had passed him by. Now he was surrounded by the family he'd never dared to dream of: a son who had become a successful young man, a co-grandfather who had become a true friend, and soon a daughter-in-law who would add even more joy to their lives. "You know," Robert said, as if reading Jake's thoughts, "when I first came here to take Danny, I thought I was gaining a grandson, but losing the chance for him to have a real father. I was wrong about a lot of things." "We all were," Jake said. "But we figured it out. The important thing," Danny added, "is that we figured it out together." As the sun set over the crazy mountains and Dolly wandered over to the porch hoping for treats, Jake realized that sometimes the best families were the ones that required the most work to create. They had taken a broken situation, a traumatized boy, a lonely rancher, and an estranged grandfather, and built something beautiful out of the pieces. It hadn't been easy, and it hadn't happened overnight. But they had learned that love was bigger than law, that family was about choice as much as blood, and that sometimes the most unlikely people could become exactly what each other needed. Looking at his son and his son's grandfather, Jake smiled. He had started this journey with only a mule and a broken heart. Now he had more family than he knew what to do with, and his heart was full. Sometimes that's all it took: being willing to open your heart to possibilities you'd never imagined, and trusting that love would find a way to make everything work out in the end. The end.